Well, welcome here. I'm Bradley Jersak with St. Stephen's University, and today I have a friend with me who's particularly special in a number of our connections. One, we both have a common bishop, Chris E.W. Green, and we love him, and we're both writing for Brazos Press right now. And so welcome here, Joash.
Thanks,
And
Dr. Zach. Yeah, such an honor. Yeah.
please call me Bradley. And why don't we start with that? You've just come out with a book that I do want to promote, and tell
Yeah.
us the title, what's it about, and I think that'll lead into our discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's called The Justice of Jesus, and it is a brand new book with Brazos Press. Comes out at the end of September. Uh, you're able to order it wherever you order your copies, but um, this book really is a reflection of the journey I've had in unpacking my own story that really goes 2,000 years back. So, um, my ancestors are St. Thomas Indian Christians, people who were brought to the Lord through the Apostle Thomas 2,000 years ago. And so, my ancestors have been everything from Orthodox to Catholic to Anglican to Pentecostal for the last 5 generations. And this shaped me deeply growing up. I still find myself unable to look down on any one tradition or look up on any one tradition. I think every tradition has Jesus, and we all have things to learn from each other. Um, but yeah, I was born and raised in Mumbai, India. Moved to the States when I was 18, um, and then worked first in Georgia Republican politics before Jesus saved me again, as I like to joke, uh, and moved to Canada 4 years ago. I've been working in international human rights for the last 10 years, and that's really where I encountered Jesus in a fresh way again, in a way that pushed me to explore more of my own story and what it is that my ancestors believed for 1,500 years before the Portuguese colonizers showed up and then the English colonizers. But really, it's in doing the work of justice that I've encountered Jesus in the margins. And, one of the reasons why I wrote this book is because noticed a massive disconnect coming to the West from the Global South Church, where justice is emphasized as an important part of the gospel, even in the Global South Evangelical Church. And working in international human rights in the West, leading church partnerships in the US and Canada, regularly coming across evangelical church leaders saying, "What's the point of rescuing kids from human trafficking if their souls go to hell? Aren't they dead in the water anyway?" Right. And so such theology was foreign to me. And I started asking questions like, where does this theology come from? Because this looks nothing like Jesus. And, it's in the course of asking those questions that I came into colonization and the history of colonization, learning about how it shaped the Western church to resist justice. So the whole thesis of the book is that colonization wasn't just bad for the global South; it was also bad for the Western church. It wasn't just bad for our indigenous neighbors here in North America; it was also bad for the Western church because it shaped us to resist justice for our marginalized neighbors because of our participation. And ultimately, this, Brad, but injustice isn't just bad for the humanity of the oppressed; it's also bad for the humanity of the oppressors and those on their side. And I think we as a Western church have a lot of reckoning to do, but also a lot of reframing. And where do we go from here? So the first 3 chapters of this book is a diagnosis of how we got here, but really the next 6 chapters are a hopeful prognosis of where do we go from here? How do we decolonize our pulpits, our budgets, our theology, our education, and how do we engage through prayer, generosity, and advocacy in ways that prioritizes justice, Jesus's way instead of empire's
Well, I mean, what a marvelous outline of your life and this book. I do want to then dive a little deeper into a few of the particulars that you did mention. First of all, I think it would be marvelous if if and curious to folks who've not heard about the Thomas tradition, Um, what
Yeah.
can you tell us about Thomas' first encounters in India and how that's played out in the Church of India prior to colonization?
Absolutely. So, St. Thomas arrived in India in AD 52 and planted 7 churches while he was there. And his early converts were essentially a mix of uh, local Jewish traders. So, there was a Jewish trading community that was there among the Jewish diaspora. And so, St. Thomas, like the other apostles, first went to the synagogues to proclaim the gospel there, and then went to the Gentiles in that society that was mostly upper caste Hindu Brahmins. So my ancestors are a mix of the Jewish traders and the upper caste Hindu Brahmins, and so there's beautiful history there. St. Thomas Indian Christians, were later strengthened. So for about 300 years, um, there wasn't a lot of contact or communion with the rest of the one Holy Catholic Apostolic Church. So they did their own thing, but didn't have that community, that fellowship. And so around the 300s, you had um, the persecution of many Persian Christians by the Persian Empire for reasons connected to Rome, as we now know. And so you had a wave of Persian Christians come to Kerala, where these 7 churches were, and strengthen them through mixing with them, and mostly stayed endogamous, but also brought connection with the Persian church in that way, and yeah, so it was a so that was strengthened. The church was strengthened then, and then in 1498, you have Vasco da Gama, a Portuguese explorer, arrive in India, being told that there was this mysterious community of Christians that had been around, and runs into them. And it's interesting. I talk about this in the book too. But for the first few years, the Portuguese Empire, through the Jesuits, that were very much empire Jesuits under the Portuguese Empire instead of under the Vatican. But the Portuguese Empire first tried to play nice with my ancestors. My ancestors were traders. They're also warriors. So there was an understanding that okay, maybe these people would be helpful. But then over time, the Portuguese church realized that my ancestors controlled access to the spice lands, and that's really what the Portuguese were there for. So then it went from, hey, these are distant cousins in Christ, even though there was a racial inferiority complex. But it went from that to wait a second, we need to subjugate them, and there's clear evidence. The King of Portugal writing to the Portuguese colonizers, and even the Vatican, saying we need to subjugate this tradition because Saint Thomas is inferior to Saint Peter. Was
Okay.
kind of the, and so they tried all sorts of things to do that. There were married clergy at that time, and those clergy were told to abandon their spouses, creating widows and orphans, right? So tried all kinds of stuff. So for about 100 years there, my ancestors were Catholic, and then they had this revolt because um, there was this dynamic where the Portuguese Catholics were using the sword to keep away bishops from coming. So the church in Persia and Syria would send in bishops through ship to check in on this church, and the Portuguese naval vessels intercepted those vessels, and on one occasion even beheaded one of those bishops in Kerala. And so after that, there was this rebellion called the Coonan Cross Oath in 1599, and they kind of separated. But the one thing I could go on this forever. There was the Anglican influence, and you have the Marthoma Church today. That's a branch of that. That's an Anglican communion denomination. You have evangelicals who've come up from that. Majority of them are Orthodox in communion with the Orthodox Church, and then you also have You have two branches of the St. Thomas Church that are Catholic. That have cardinals in Vatican representing them too. So fascinating history there. But the thing I find interesting, and I call this out in the book, is in 1599. The Portuguese did the synod called the Synod of Diamper, where they basically burned, Taliban style, they burned a bunch of ancient church documents. And
Oh,
yeah, and and it's heartbreaking because so much of the liturgy, so much of the theology has been lost to history, and we don't have the written evidence of what exactly these St. Thomas Indian Christians believed before their exposure to empire and colonization. But what's beautiful is that in the midst of this, there have been oral traditions that have still been preserved. And as you
okay.
know, this in indigenous cultures, oral traditions are actually more reliable than the written, tradition. Because anyone can write their version of history, but there's a sense of beauty in the oral tradition and historicity. And so so we have those oral traditions still preserved that share a lot about St. Thomas and the beliefs of the ancient St. Thomas Church. But the two values that I try to pull out from the St. Thomas Indian tradition that I think we need to recover in the Western Church um, as values of ancient Christianity are ecumenism and pluralism. So ecumenism, they lived in peaceful ecumenical relationships with the Coptic Church, um, with the Greek Church, with every branch of the Orthodox Church they came into contact with, and tried to do that with the Catholic Church too, until the Catholic Church tried to subjugate them. So ecumenism is something we can learn from, but also pluralism. These Christians were very much Christian universalists in their beliefs, and this blew my mind. And I'll be honest, Brad, like the one of my first exposures to Christian universalism was your voice. Someone sent me a podcast that you did and said, "Hey, you should listen to this," and I listened to it, and I was like, "This is fascinating because he's pulling from the Orthodox tradition, but." What if this is just some modern Western stuff, right? And I wasn't quite there yet. But then what really did it for me was finding out that my ancestors believed in this until their exposure to colonization. Yeah, so a lot of history
In some ways, I want to move on, but I'm just curious. So, a couple things. One is I've actually I, I've investigated the oral tradition and been fascinated. And a funny thing that happened was I was in a church and I was sharing some of this, and I remember the elders in the front row getting really furrowed brows, and I'm like, "Oh, you guys are doubting Thomas."
there.
They were doubting Thomas, and
Right.
because they, for them, it's like if it's not in the Bible, it can't have happened. I'm like, in fact, the Bible is a subset, a beautiful core subset of our oral tradition. There were,
Yeah.
you know, the Bible's a result of the first years of oral tradition. And why would that end with the Bible, right? And so you get these amazing stories about saints like Thomas, especially he's a fascinating one. And I think we have more oral tradition about him than we do of many of the other apostles. But
Mm,
my question too is that in those initial encounters, you mentioned that the Brahmins, which is like the Hindu priesthood, right?
yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
actually, some of them become leadership in these seven churches. Um, my experience with indigenous peoples is some of them you can have quite a good coexistent um, thing where, let's say, the people who buy into the Jesus story still have a good connection with the others, and others they can become quite conservative, and it's like, oh, that's
Mm,
all demons now, right? And so, what was that like in terms of
yeah.
the early, I know it's 2,000 years, right? But
Yeah.
was there quite a a relationship with the Hindus after, or was there a hostility? How did that go?
No, I'm so glad you asked. And that speaks to the pluralism value that I try to pull out here, which is what you see is solid evidence of pluralism. Even to this day, there's a lot of pluralism where they learn to live at peace with their majority Hindu neighbors, and also Muslims and Buddhists and people from other religions they came into contact with. What's even beautiful is you see a lot of traditions in the St. Thomas Church that continue to this day in all of their traditions, where uh, a lot of local Hindu traditions were incorporated
Yeah.
into a contextualized indigenous Christianity. So, like things within wedding ceremonies or funerals or celebrations of life. Yeah, yeah,
I really want to highlight something you just said.
yeah.
It's you used an expression that I think is far superior to what is often dismissive, where we would call it syncretism. But you called it contextualized, indigenous. What's your
Yeah.
phrase?
Yeah, contextualized indigenous Christianity. Yeah.
That's beautiful. And it sees where aspects of the culture can be contextualized. It's
Yes.
very good.
Yes.
One last thing, maybe for now,
Yeah.
on the Indian tradition, and
Yeah.
that's something I learned from you is although I have a conservative impulse to pull from the earliest, and I think that's a good thing to do. I've heard you mention that it wasn't until the Pentecostal movement where they were able to kind of undermine caste system thinking. Can you tell us about
Yes.
that?
Yeah, yeah. And this is why I'm also proud of my Pentecostal heritage within the St. Thomas history. So you have Indian scholars today who found evidence that in 1860s, 1880s, early 1900s, you had a few waves of charismatic revivals break out within the Marthoma Church, the Anglican communion branch of the St. Thomas Church. And just to put things in context, this is going to be pre-Azusa Street,
Yeah.
right? So I know that we charismatic folks in the West often think that was, kind of the marquee moment for the charismatic movement, but global church history would dispute that because there was a charismatic revival in India and Kerala among this community. And what I really love about this revival and how I know it truly was a revival is because we tend to use words like revival in the West and not think about justice, but when there's a move of the Spirit, as we see in the book of Acts in the early church, uh, barriers have to be broken down. Jesus has to become more accessible to people who've been in the out group, and that's exactly what happened here in Kerala, where shamefully for the first 1800 years or so of the St. Thomas Church, lower caste Hindus were kept out of the church, and so there wasn't proselytizing done by the church. There wasn't evangelism done by the church for a few reasons. One is Christian universalism, the law of Saint Thomas is what it's called. Other being different biblical interpretation of the Great Commission as something that was fulfilled by the apostles in their hearing when the apostle Thomas came to them, instead of something that is still for the church today. But then also, there was definitely an element of casteism and participating in the caste oppression of their lower caste neighbors. In fact, this is why our family histories are so well preserved. It's because we wanted to protect our caste status with local Hindu rulers. And
Okay.
that's the shameful side of our history of why, we know where we come from, because we did that to protect our own privilege in that community. And so yes, you had people who were intentionally kept out of the church from receiving the sacraments, from receiving Jesus. And then for the very first time in the history of the St. Thomas Church, you now had lower caste people included in the life of the church, included in access to the sacraments. And that was through the Pentecostal revival taking place in My ancestors, 5 generations ago, were a big part of that in the early 1900s. In fact, the first so there's a denomination that came out of this that's still around today called the Indian Pentecostal Church. It's
Hmm.
a Malayalam Pentecostal movement that still has diaspora, roots all over the world today. But this indigenous Pentecostal movement that's self-funded, it's not funded from the West like the Assemblies of God movement. This movement was started by my ancestors, and the very first um, Indian Pentecostal church wedding was actually my great grandparents on my dad's
Oh, wow.
side. So
That's awesome.
a little bit of lore there, but so I'm proud of that side of my ancestry too, and this is why I'm not willing to discount the Pentecostal side of my theology, because I think there's something beautiful and justice oriented there too that still needs to be retrieved and focused on.
Totally. Well, let's now shift from that story into some, I think, some of the concepts where it will help folks in terms of um, definitions. So
Yeah,
imagine that we have listeners or students who who've been hearing this word colonize,
yeah,
or haven't heard this word colonize, or colonized Christianity. What I'd like to do over the next moments is, first of all, tell us what that means exactly, what it looks like, and then we can move into some of your hopeful decolonizing
yeah,
practices and ways. So, what's colonize mean? What's it
yeah.
entail?
Absolutely. So, it's unfortunate that words like colonization and decolonization are so politically charged today and
Yeah,
only seen as academic concepts. Now, yes, they are academic concepts, but the reality is that to Global South Christians, they're more than academic concepts. To people like me, it's our lived experience.
yeah,
Our lives have been shaped by colonization, our health. Things, the infrastructure, the justice systems in countries like mine have been shaped by colonization. Um,
and
so
Canada for that matter, right? I mean, you've got the
yes,
global south, but this is a real issue right
totally,
now for us here. It's so relevant on Turtle Island, as we'd call it.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean,
All right.
and the
So it's a
reality,
lived
yeah,
experience, first of all.
it's a lived experience. And just from I'm learning so much about the indigenous context here in Canada, even through the eyes of my indigenous neighbors here. But from the context of my community, I grew up in India, being taught history, and this is all verifiable fact. But um, before colonization, India contributed 20% of the world's GDP. And after the Brits left in 1947, it was down to 1%, right? So there's something going on there. And basically, what colonization was an extraction of wealth and resources by Western empires all across the world, the global South for sure, but also here in North America. And and when I say the extraction of wealth and resources, it was to enrich, people, elites in the West, not all people in the West, but the elites. Um, and what's really interesting about this is that this is where the transatlantic slave trade comes from, right? It was a symptom of colonization because the extraction of wealth and resources included human resources. It included the extraction of people from India to go work on plantations in the Caribbean and other parts of Asia too. And so that's what colonization was. It was the systemic extraction of wealth and resources for the enrichment of some people in the West. And so decolonization, then, I think, in a faith context, or yeah, sorry, I don't know if you wanted to add something there.
Yeah. So before we move to
Yes, yes,
decolonization,
yes,
let's now tell me about how faith or
yes,
religion gets colonized. So there's there's this justice element of colonizing resources, a hegemony,
Yes.
exploiting property, exploiting resources. There's
Yes.
but it also seems to me, well, and people included, it also seems to me that colonization has deposited something or shaped something that gets left behind and deforms what faith had been. So, what does a colonized Christianity look like?
Yeah, that's so good. So in the book, I have four tenets of the colonizer's gospel, and I can walk through those. Um, because yeah, you're right. The reality is that our understanding of the gospel was shaped by our participation in this injustice. So tenet one of the colonizer's gospel is Jesus came primarily to save souls. So it's just what colonizers told their colonized and enslaved people is Jesus cares way more about the salvation of your souls than the freedom and well-being of your human bodies, right? And I think this is perhaps one of the biggest lies about the gospel. This is why we've over spiritualized the gospel so much in the West. It's been shaped by, you know, those we've inherited our understanding of Christianity from in the West, slaveholders and colonizers who benefited from preaching this imputed gospel to the people they subjugated. Tenet two is justice is a worthy pursuit, but evangelism and discipleship are more important, right? And again, the gospel of Jesus can't separate these things, but the colonizer's gospel tends to remove justice and tries to have evangelism and discipleship on its own. Um, and yeah, and you know, I say this in the book too. Um, as someone who was himself a marginalized brown Palestinian Jewish refugee, Jesus of Nazareth engaged in justice, verbal proclamation of the kingdom of God, and discipleship. These are all connected and cannot be separated from one another. Um, and additionally, the you know what I say is the ability to see justice as separate, less than, or secondary to evangelism and discipleship is a privilege that survivors of violence do not have. And then the third tenet that I share of the colonizer's gospel is that social hierarchies are natural and part of God's design. So again, it benefited the colonizers to preach, you know, these social hierarchies that they proofread from scripture, from Paul's epistles, and had men, women, children, and then slaves, colonized people, black, brown people, and even among uh, racial categories, there were these hierarchies that you see. Yeah,
Now, in the case of both India and Turtle Island, you you do have some of that already happening pre-contact, let's say with your caste system in
yeah,
India,
absolutely.
but also like between nations in North America where
Mm,
slavery and stuff was happening. But the point here is the gospel came and didn't end that. The gospel came here and amplified it and
mm,
gave it a, a theology like to and so in that sense even if we could say well they were already doing that, it's like okay, now it was happening times 10 and we're creating a Christian doctrine to uphold that abuse and misuse of the peoples. Does that sound right?
absolutely. Absolutely. And in the case of casteism in India, um, historians today will tell you that caste was actually more fluid before colonization.
Oh, wow.
So you weren't locked into a particular caste. It was more around the role you played in society with your occupation. You know, so you had the Brahmins who were the religious priests, you had the warriors, you had the traders, and then you had lower caste, untouchable folks. So there was more
Okay.
fluidity between these caste systems, but then colonizers came in and made them rigid uh,
Yeah.
because that rigidity was helpful to extract wealth and resources.
Okay. And did you have a fourth point, or was that the fourth point?
Yes, the fourth point is a quick one. Unity demands uniformity. Just this, and this is what this is the experience that my ancestors had with Portuguese Catholics, and saying your way of worshiping Jesus is inferior to our way of worshiping Jesus, and you need to change your theology, your liturgy, your praxis to be in line with ours and keep it uniform across the world.
Okay. I want to think with you together on something
Yeah,
about I'm wondering if we take those as the four foundation pieces of a colonized Christianity, it feels to me like then you end up building a let's say retributive theology versus restorative theology works better on that foundation. Does that seem right? Does it ring true?
absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of more warped, twisted stuff will then come from those four foundations. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm thinking explicitly about like images of God that are uglier and harsher and meaner that, well, that seem a lot more like slave masters and imperial subjugators. It's like that kind of God makes more sense in that kind of system, right? And let's move now to decolonizing. So how do we begin to decolonize our theology and or our practice too, right? It's not just abstraction, as you said. And I guess on two registers. So one is um, the practices of Christian colonization that need to be undone for the sake of those who experienced victimization in that, and then also decolonizing myself as a colonizer, or to the degree that I've inherited, let's say that European theology. So, and because you said that damages me too. It's not just those who are victims, but the moral injury that comes from being an oppressor. So, is that two things, or is it, how do you present
Yeah.
decolonization?
Yeah, so part two, section two of the book is decolonizing the Western Church, and there are three chapters in this: decolonizing our theology, decolonizing our communities, and decolonizing our budgets. And so I focus on
Now
the
you're meddling, right? Budgets. Uh, can't we leave my wallet out of this? No, no, we can't. But all right, take us
yeah,
through it.
yeah, save the best for the last there. But I think in the context of faith, then um, decolonization to me is a means to an end. It's not the end destination for
Okay.
us as Christians. It's a means towards loving our neighbor better and loving God better by loving our neighbor better. Um,
Let me pause there and just say, if we need to just hear that really carefully, that it's a means to an end. Here's an issue that can happen in justice work, that we can be so focused on decolonization or whatever, let's say, on colonization as the disease, that
yeah,
we can become infatuated with the disease in a way that says, no, the means are the end. Let's just keep. That's
correct.
the gospel, is to talk about decolonization. No, it's taking us somewhere, is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And I think it's taking us towards a retrieval of seeing Jesus at work in all societies and cultures um, before the colonizer's gospel came in and warped our view of God and the image of
Okay,
God.
so we're retrieving something and it's bigger and more beautiful. And
Yes,
that's the goal. Yeah. Okay.
yes, yes, yes. It's taking us closer historically to Jesus of Nazareth. Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. Yeah. I Pardon me for interrupting, but
Oh, please.
let's walk through those three again.
Yeah. So, in decolonizing our theology, I talk specifically about decolonizing our pulpits, and I basically call attention to how, throughout history, you've seen pulpits um, being co-opted by empires. And I also call attention to church history, where for the first 1500 years of the church, um, the pulpit wasn't the center of the Sunday morning liturgical experience, right? It was the Eucharistic table.
Yes.
Um, and so this is something that will likely poke some holes in my progressive evangelical friends' theology, but I don't think we get better by um, just, you know, keeping the same frameworks without realizing it and planting similar style churches with slightly better theology and slightly better preaching, right? I think we get better by centering the Eucharistic table and Jesus's real presence at the table, which I call infallible and inerrant. Jesus's real presence at the table, compared to the preacher's presence at the pulpit, which is errant and fallible, right?
Very good. Very good. Yeah. I'm
And
with you.
yeah, and and I think this is something that we need to wrestle with. That I think we have centered the pulpit and the preacher so much in the liturgical experience today that it's taken the focus away from Jesus. Um, and it's also taken the focus away from our marginalized neighbors because who are the people that we center in the pulpit? There are people from majority culture, people with power and privileged status and empire. And they're not people from marginalized communities that we tend to center in the pulpit. And this is also why it's important for us to center Jesus at the table, uh, Jesus who came in the form of marginalized human flesh. I think there's something there. I think when we see Jesus at the table and we cultivate the eyes to see Jesus at the table, we'll also be better at seeing Jesus at work on the margins. I think there's something mystical that happens there.
Very good. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I also talk about intentionally centering marginalized teachers in the pulpit, and to whatever degree is possible, realistically. Yeah, I talk about recentering the table. I quote our mutual friend, Father David Harvey, a good bit in there. He's been a
Good.
profound influence in my journey. I also talk about decolonizing Western Christian education. And I know this is of particular interest to the work that you're doing at St. Stephen's. Um,
Absolutely.
I specifically focus on Dr. Anthony Reddy at Oxford. And he's Oxford's professor of Black theology, Black liberation theologian. And he talks about um, infusing colonized Christianity. He says that the best way um, to decolonize is to infuse the perspectives of people from the margins into whatever frameworks of Christianity we're working with today, and see what that does to that mix. And so that's the direction I lean into. Um, and he also talks about you know um, people who have enjoyed privileged status and empire, like your Jonathan Edwards and others, who are lionized and venerated today, despite um, you know clear abuses that they lived out, like owning people in slavery, and there's propensity in a Western Christianity that, and we're seeing this right now too. When you criticize heroes, you're seen as criticizing the Christian faith, and that needs to be untangled there a little bit too. So
Yeah.
that's decolonizing our theology, decolonizing our communities. I go into a lot of St. Thomas history, talk about unity and diversity. Um, I talk about being Jesus centered at the table, and how everyone has a seat at Jesus's table,
Yes.
and also give the example of my church, Lakeside Church, where we'll be doing an event soon together in October. But this is a church that has a unique history of basically doing away with their old statement of faith that had positions on everything, every secondary, tertiary issue, and saying our new statement of faith is the Nicene Creed, and everything
Oh, good.
else we
Yeah.
hold loosely. You know?
Yeah.
and
We, there is something there's this concern for doctrinal precision
Yes.
that was all about building our walls around us. And I think the irony was uh, rewriting the Nicene Creed for our own. That itself was a heretical act.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'm again with you. The I'm really happy for what that church is doing and glad you're part of it.
Yeah, yeah. And what this means is you'll have a wide variety of people politically, right? I've got people I go to church with um, who would be considered Maple MAGA, people who want Canada to be a part of America.
Yep.
Uh, and I've got people I go to church with who are LGBTQ inclusive in their theology. And then I've got people in the church who aren't, who hold to a more traditional sexuality of marriage. Um, and then we all have people at our churches who don't really care about the issue because it doesn't really affect them personally, right? But how do we be
How
united at
how
the
how do
table?
you be united? What's your trick, Joash?
Yeah. And not that Lakeside or any other church has gotten this right, but I think we can attempt to be more Jesus centered and
Yeah.
more table centered, where we're all one in Christ, and there's no Jew nor Greek, no LGBTQ inclusive or traditional. No pro-abortion or pro-women, pro-Israel, pro-Gaza. We're all one in Christ at the table. And so I talk about political unity at the table as a way of decolonizing our communities from a gospel that believes that unity is uniformity, and being united in the creeds instead. Um, yeah, and then I talk about decolonizing our budgets, saving the best for last in that section, where I quote Saint Irenaeus of Lyon, early church leader, and he says, and this is how he describes tithing essentially, right? He says, instead of tithes, which the law commanded, the Lord said to divide everything we have with the poor. And this is how the early church viewed tithing. It was dividing everything you have with the poor, not just your 10%, but everything you own. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it belongs to the Lord. So the first paragraph of that chapter is, this is a book about justice. But as you probably picked up by now, this is also a book about wealth. Whether or not we're comfortable acknowledging this, there is a direct correlation between how we view money and how we view justice. Um, and Jesus also said, "Where your money is, there your heart will also be." And I think it's important for us to reckon with that and see um, how our budgets have been shaped in such colonized way, especially Christian ministry world, but also individually. And so one example of this that I provide is a conversation that I had with and I keep the bad examples anonymous and the good examples I name here. But I had a conversation with the outreach pastor, one of the largest churches in Canada, and he was telling me he was in a meeting with his senior pastor. They had a surplus in their budget of $30,000, and they had a decision: do we give to our anti-human trafficking partners locally and globally, or do we give to another partner that parachutes radios, Christian radios, into parts of Europe? And so they went with the latter. They went with parachuting Christian radios into parts of Europe because if there was a chance that some people would be saved uh, with their eternal destination, that was more important
Uh,
budgetarily than rescuing children from human trafficking or caring for their needs, right? And so, and this isn't like a culty church. This is a mainstream evangelical church in Canada making decisions like this, and so that needs to be decolonized. Our colonization of our theology then shapes the colonization of our missions priorities and where we spend our money, or even expectations that um, I will only sponsor children with this organization if they're explicitly teaching children about Jesus, if they're doing this in Jesus' name, right? Or I will only support this Christian ministry for unhoused people if they're making unhoused people come attend a Bible study, right? Which is common, unfortunately.
Hmm. And that's a kind of colonization itself, isn't it?
Yes,
All right. Now I'll complicate it a little bit for you
please.
because I know that you ooze this stuff in a way that I won't have gotcha questions.
No.
But for me, I'm part of a board of a wonderful ministry called Impact Nations. They're
Mm,
really good at being mindful not to colonize, but finding partners are on the ground who are doing good work, who just who need us to do the reverse of hegemony. That is,
mm,
serve them. Is there a way we can serve you? And it's like, well, you know what? We have a little hospital for teenagers who have been impregnated through abuse, and their bodies are too young to deliver these babies without assistance. But we don't have them. They're bringing them in wheelbarrows. It would help us to have an ambulance, and we're like, well, we could do that, and boom. But we're not messing with how they do it then, right? That's the goal anyway. Here's the trick. Sometimes in contact, let's say with our African partners, for example, we're finding Christian partners that appear to me to have been thoroughly colonized.
yeah.
And some of their practices they've inherited from 200 years of colonizing relief and development or missions workers. And so
Yeah.
it feels weird, though, to say, um, we don't want you to do it that way anymore because now we're just recolonizing them.
Right.
But at
Right.
the same time, saying, the kingdom of God has impacted us and we've repented of some stuff. And
Yeah.
now we're coming to you yet again saying, we think what we're seeing in you is actually bad fruit from us.
Mm.
I sup- so I'm guessing out loud that the best way for us to handle that is to say we think we're seeing something ugly of us showing up over there, but it's
Mm.
for you to decide what to let go of and what to keep. Does that seem
Mm.
reasonable, or how do you feel?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And I mean, yeah, I get it. I work in international development myself. I have for the last decade. These are day-to-day realities.
Yeah.
There is so much of Christianity in the global south that has been colonized. Um, I wonder what it looks like to just have an honest, conversation, dialogical, where, and I don't know what it looks like to even come in with a posture of, hey, we're not speaking to you as your funding partners,
Yeah,
because that power is often implied in the relationship, right?
absolutely. Yeah.
And unfortunately, my guess is that those partners there are possibly, I mean, not possibly, definitely good people who care about the physical well-being of people in their community, but
Absolutely.
have probably been shaped in ways where they feel like they have to justify the spiritual aspect of their work to funding partners in the West, because that is the norm within Christian ministries, unfortunately.
Okay. So that's a very specific, good example of your third section there about
Yes.
decolonizing budgets. A lot of that has to do with if you're going to come alongside, remember that if you're a donor, that won't feel like coming alongside to someone who may infer conditions and that they have to say the right thing in
Yeah.
return.
Yeah.
My goodness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I learned this from a former colleague of mine who is actually the one who introduced me to your work, who's now the chief development officer at Mustard Seed, Phil Calvert, and he taught me this. He said, at the end of the day, whose voices are we centering? Whose voices are we prioritizing? And is the voice of the donor louder than the voice of our marginalized neighbors, right? Unfortunately, in church history, we have prioritized the voice of the donor over the voice of our marginalized neighbors. But the work of justice means the two have to live together in a relationship of mutuality. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. it's a tricky one. I just had this
Totally.
conversation this morning is like, do we say certain things out
Right.
of our convictions that would impact donations
Mm,
that would impact the people we're trying to help because we
right.
use the word. Now, am I just saying things cathartically so I feel better about myself at the expense of those who won't get that money? Or
Yeah.
do I have to be faithful and prophetic even with our donors and say, we're actually willing to lose you if for the sake of these people, and we believe if we're faithful, God will bring other people or something. But you could see the dance I'm talking about. You've
Totally.
lived it. You've
Totally.
lived it. Yeah.
Totally. And this is where I really appreciate so I've done the work of fundraising. I lead fundraising teams over the past decade, and at the same time, I'm a deacon, right? And so there's this pastoral, priestly kind
Mm.
of call to how I see our donors, right? And so I think ultimately Christian justice organizations have a responsibility to not see their donors as dollar signs, as a bank account, but as human beings who also need to be shaped in the ways of Jesus, right? And that is hard work because um, the easy thing to do would be to see our donors as just bank accounts and not prophetically invite them to come on that journey of being shaped by Jesus in the margins. But I
Yeah.
feel like as Christian justice organizations, we get to stand in the middle and advocate on behalf of our marginalized neighbors and elevate their voices and allow our donors to also be shaped by their voices instead of just you know just making sure that we're not upsetting the apple cart too much and that the checks keep coming in. I think um, ultimately, I think God cares about the humanity and the restoration of the donors too and their journey and experiencing Jesus. And I have gotten to walk as a fundraiser with so many donors and so many church communities who've been transformed by their encounter with Jesus on the margins and the ways in which that's shaped them and challenged them. And what I've seen over time is that their engagement actually gets better over time in ways that they even make up for the ones who you may lose, but it's real. And I think Christian nonprofit leaders, it's easy for us to operate from a place of fear when making these decisions. I'd love for us to operate from a place of hope and opportunity and love ultimately.
Yeah. Yeah, these aren't separate issues. It's a
No, no,
gospel
no.
issue. And for those who saying, "Oh, we've left the important stuff and gone into, budget," read Luke again. I mean, this is the a dominant theme of Luke is precisely this stuff, and it is good to return there and to say, to see how Jesus had, for him, it's one synthesized kingdom that affects everything, right? Is before we go, is there anything that we're going to be sad that we didn't talk about?
That's a good question. There is one chapter that I really enjoyed writing on advocacy. And so, I have, yeah, a decade of advocacy experience and the work of justice, especially international human rights. And so I share some real practical, tangible ways to build relationships with your member of parliament, your member of Congress, their staff teams. How do you prep to show up to a meeting? What do you say when you're in the meeting? How do you get a follow-up meeting, right? So I go very tactical in that chapter with sharing that. And I say, ultimately, um, it's important for us as Christians to recognize that our political leaders are human beings made in the image of God. They're children of God. And at the same time, they're also agents of empire, right?
Yeah.
So don't give your pulpit to an agent of empire on a Sunday morning,
Yep.
um, but engage with them, pray for them, and be politically agnostic, except on behalf of our marginalized neighbors.
Yeah. I think Shane Claiborne has helped me with this a little bit, in the sense of even when it, what's the role of the church? The role of church is not to take over the government by voting our guy in.
Yeah.
It is to sort through how to be Nathan to David. And
Yes.
and but I do have two questions about advocacy you might be able to help
Yeah.
me with, or some of our folks. So let me try to remember them. One has to do with being performative, and the other has to do with using up bandwidth. So that'll help me remember. So the
Yes.
first thing is I'm so concerned about some issues, and so I will address them, in blogs or on Instagram or whatever. Um, but I'm also conscious of, uh, did I feel pressured to speak up to massage my own guilt or to look good or to measure up to demands of those who need me to, and so we're talking about
Yeah.
performative justice at that point. Do you have any advice for people who struggle with that issue?
Yeah. Yeah. So in the book, I talk about cheap justice and the justice of Jesus. So I
Yep.
call performative virtue signaling justice cheap justice. And both conservatives and progressives are equally guilty of cheap justice, a justice that has no cost to them ultimately. So it's easy to advocate for certain issues if it doesn't cost you anything. Like, I tell this to, and I say this as a former pro-life Republican lobbyist in Georgia. I tell this to pro-life Christian men. I say, it costs you nothing to be pro-life uh,
Mm,
for children in the womb, right? So
mm,
what does that pursuit of justice in that issue look like for you, where it does cost you something to stand with the marginalized group you are concerned about here, and at the same time have care for women and mothers. We don't have to pick and choose. Empire tells us we have to pick and choose, but the way of Jesus transcends everything and stands with all our marginalized neighbors in any given
yeah.
moment.
Okay.
And
And
so,
virtue signaling was an interesting phrase you used too, right?
yes,
That's about trying to look like something. Well,
yes,
that's egoism and branding. That's
totally.
not caring.
Totally. And yeah, and I also talk about land acknowledgements, which are pretty big in Canada. That can be a form of virtue signaling.
Yeah.
I actually mention land acknowledgements in my chapter on prayer, where I say, just like land acknowledgements are meant to shape us to stand in solidarity with our Indigenous neighbors, prayer is also meant to shape us to do the same and stand with God as He does that. So yeah, so I don't think performative justice is the solution. I think ultimately it's asking ourselves, what is best for my marginalized neighbor here, and how do I prioritize that? And that can even be in the context of what you said with fundraising, right? Like, as Christian justice organizations, you're often asked to take positions on any and everything going on in the world. And ultimately, I think it's important to ask ourselves, well, we could do that, but where is the line between being performative and actually, caring for our donors and our marginalized
A
neighbors?
real mission, yeah. Okay, and then part B was to do with bandwidth. So what I
Yeah.
mean by that is this. I feel like sometimes we need to be a voice for the voiceless, and at other times we displace their voice. We
Mm,
use up the bandwidth. And I suppose this goes back a little bit to the pulpit, right? It's like whatever my pulpit happens to be, if I'm if if I'm like a straightish white man uh, who who who's talking a lot as an advocate
mm,
for LGBTQ people, for women, for people of color, and so on, but I'm doing all the talking. I get it if they don't have a voice, but if I think I'm the voice now and they don't get a moment to share, or they get a moment to share, but I'm the show,
mm.
that's troubling to me. Do you have a sense of balance in when to be their voice and when to give them voice?
Yeah, that's really good. I think, I mean, I have privilege and I also need allies at the same time as a person of color, right? As an immigrant. And right now, there's a lot of hatred towards immigrants, both in the US and Canada. I've felt that, especially Indian immigrants in Canada, there's like this rising hatred that I've felt viscerally in my body over the 4 years I've lived in Canada.
Oh, really?
Absolutely. I mean, even on social media, you see comments of, people racially targeting Indian immigrants, um, and things of that nature. So, what I've found in my personal experience is, um, sometimes I do need someone with more privilege than me to stand in the gap and advocate for me, because I would rather not deal with the racists and protect my own
Okay.
peace of mind. So in cases like that, when it comes to confronting and challenging, I do need and do appreciate people with more privilege who can do that without it affecting them that much. Same goes for our sisters in ministry. They don't want to be caught up in these endless debates on women in ministry. They would rather just go and do their ministry. So you and I have privilege then to stand in the gap for them and be a good ally to them. So I think in those cases, absolutely, there is a place for allyship. Um, but I do feel like at the same time, we do need to be centering the needs and voices of our marginalized neighbors without exposing them to harm, without exposing them to more hatred. And when they start to get that hatred, jump in and say, hey, that's not okay. But I think we do that in a Jesus-like way. And we see Jesus, doing this in Philippians 2. He, comes down to earth and lays aside his divine privileges, takes on marginalized human flesh. Um, so yes, there is a place to be an advocate and to speak up. But again, I think it's that question of, is this performative, or is this actually costing me something too, that
Right.
we need to discern?
I think one area where I can think of it being helpful
Yeah.
I is in terms of repentance. Maybe it carries more weight for me to say we need to repent than for you to come and say you need to repent. That,
Yes.
that could be an area where there's just a strategic advantage in us owning our sin rather than you trying to convince us of it. But we also will benefit from hearing your stories about so that trigger empathy.
Yes.
If that weren't a sin,
Right.
we're in a bad, we're 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 in a mess right now.
Yeah.
I I I I, I, I suppose I don't care who the audience is, whether it's our students or people I put this for blogging. It's like we're we're in a shit show,
Yeah. We
and
are.
in the midst of that, we do need the minority report of prophetic people like you, Joash, and anytime where you need a platform, I'm happy to make space for that. But also, anytime you need someone to just say, I've got your back. Let me handle this. Just let me know,
I
and
appreciate that.
we're
I
brothers,
appreciate
and
yeah, I
uh,
appreciate that so
I'm
much.
grateful.
Same. Same.
Well, I'm saturated now, so I don't know about you listening, but I this will be the first of other conversations and ongoing friendship and relationship, both with me and with St. Stephen's University, because your voice is precisely aligned with our our aspirations, I
Mhm.
suppose. So thank you
Wow.
for taking the
Honored.
time with me
Thank you.
today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, Brad.
Bless you.
Blessings.
I'm gonna